This photo of three children seemed innocent until experts uncovered a hidden truth. The antique shop in Charleston smelled of old wood and mothballs. Marcus Williams had been browsing estate sale items for more than an hour when he noticed the small daguerreotype in a tarnished silver frame, half hidden behind a stack of depression glass. As a researcher for the Equal Justice Initiative, documenting the legacy of slavery in America, Marcus had trained himself to look for images that told stories beyond their surfaces. This photograph stopped him cold. Three children, likely between 8 and 10 years old, sat together on an ornate garden bench. Two white children, a boy and a girl, with blonde ringlets, flanked a black child in the center. All three wore expensive clothing. The white boy was dressed in a tailored suit with a bow tie, the girl in an elaborate dress with lace trim. The black child wore equally fine clothes, a pressed white shirt, dark vest, and trousers matching the white boy's. The children were smiling genuine smiles, not the rigid formality typical of 1,850 photography. Their bodies were close, comfortable. The white girl's hand rested on the black child's shoulder. The boy leaned in slightly, as if they'd been laughing just before the photographer captured the moment. At first glance, it appeared to be a touching testament to childhood friendship. An image that suggested innocence, transcending the racial barriers of antebellum South Carolina, as if the children of that era saw beyond the prejudices of their parents. But Marcus had learned never to accept such images at face value. He picked up the frame, studying it under the shop's dim lighting. The back bore a faded inscription: Summer 1854. Charleston. A photographer's stamp read Whitmore Studios. He examined each child's face. The white children looked relaxed, happy. But the black child's smile, Marcus noticed, didn't reach his eyes. Something else lingered there, weariness perhaps, or fear masked by the performance of cheerfulness. Then Marcus saw it. The black child's sleeves had ridden up slightly. Around each wrist, barely visible in the photograph's sepia tones, were marks discolored bands of skin, suggesting long-term abrasion. Marcus had seen similar marks in other historical photographs and documents. They were the unmistakable evidence of shackles worn for extended periods. His hands began to shake. This wasn't a photograph of three playmates. It was something far darker, a carefully staged image that attempted to present an illusion of harmony and care while concealing a brutal truth. He purchased the photograph for $30 and walked directly to his car. Sitting in the parking lot, he examined the image again under better light, using his phone to zoom in on details. The wrist marks were undeniable, and now that he was looking more closely, he noticed other signs. The black child sat slightly forward on the bench, as if ready to stand at a moment's notice. His posture, despite the smile, was deferential, and his clothing, though expensive, was slightly too large, hand-me-downs perhaps, or garments purchased without careful fitting. This child was enslaved. Marcus was certain of it. Dressed in fine clothes and posed with his enslaver's children as if they were equals, yet marked by the chains that defined his true status. He needed to know who these children were, what had happened to them, and why someone had staged this particular photograph. He started his car and headed back to his office in Montgomery, Alabama, already planning the research that would consume the next months of his life. Back at the Equal Justice Initiative's research center, Marcus set up the daguerreotype under high-intensity lights and photographed it from every angle. The digital images revealed details invisible to the naked eye. The marks on the black child's wrists were even clearer under magnification, bands of lighter skin about an inch wide, with subtle scarring along the edges. Marcus had documented similar injuries in enslaved children who wore shackles as punishment, to prevent escape, or simply as a demonstration of power. Metal pressed constantly against flesh would lighten the skin. Movement would create scar tissue. He began with the photographer's mark. Whitmore Studios, Charleston, 1854. Historical directories showed that Edward Whitmore had operated a successful photography business in Charleston from 1851 to 1863. catering to wealthy families who could afford the expensive daguerreotype process. Whitmore advertised family portraits of distinction and children's likenesses captured with artistic sensitivity. Marcus found dozens of examples of Whitmore's work in museum collections. The photographer had a distinctive style. Outdoor settings, natural poses, careful attention to clothing, and background details that signaled wealth and status. Many portraits included enslaved servants positioned in the background to display the family's prosperity. But this photograph was different. The enslaved child wasn't in the background. He was centered, posed as if he were an equal. This wasn't about showcasing wealth. This was something else entirely. Marcus contacted colleagues at the Charleston Museum and the South Carolina Historical Society, sending them high-resolution scans. Within 2 days, he received a response from Dr. Patricia Green, a historian specializing in antebellum Charleston families. "I believe I've identified the white children," her email began. The clothing style and Whitmore Studios' connection led me to prominent Charleston families. From 1854, I found a matching photograph in our collection, a formal family portrait taken the same year, showing the Hartwell family. Colonel James Hartwell, his wife, Eleanor, and their 2 children, William and Charlotte. The children in your photograph match William and Charlotte Hartwell perfectly. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. He knew the Hartwell name. Colonel James Hartwell had been one of Charleston's wealthiest plantation owners with properties totaling over 2,000 acres and, according to the 1,850 slave schedule, ownership of 187 enslaved people. But Patricia's next paragraph struck harder. "I found a reference to this specific photograph in Eleanor Hartwell's diary, donated to our archives in the 1920s. She mentions commissioning Whitmore to photograph the children at play with their little companion. She doesn't name the black child, but she writes that William and Charlotte were quite attached to him." Marcus requested the full diary. When the scanned pages arrived, he spent 2 days reading entries from 1,852 to 1,856, searching for any mention of the boy. Eleanor wrote about her children, often their lessons, their health, their development, and she mentioned the boy repeatedly, always without using his name. Her diary painted a disturbing picture of how enslaved children lived in wealthy white households, simultaneously present and invisible, valued and disposable. Marcus compiled the most revealing excerpts. March 1853. William has become quite attached to the boy from the quarters. James says it's natural for children to play together, and the boy is well behaved and clean. I've instructed Mammy to ensure he is properly dressed when he comes to the house. July 1853. Charlotte insists the boy join her lessons. I've allowed it. Though of course he cannot learn to read or write, that would be illegal and dangerous. But he sits quietly while she practices her letters, and his presence seems to motivate her. December 1853. The boy attempted to run away last week. James was quite disappointed. We've treated him well. James had him punished appropriately and fitted with restraints to prevent future incidents. The children were upset, so I explained that discipline, while unpleasant, is necessary for the boy's own good. Marcus felt sick. The restraints Eleanor mentioned were the shackles that left the marks visible in the photograph taken 6 months later. January 1854. The boy has adjusted to his restraints. He no longer struggles and has resumed his cheerful manner with the children. William asked why the boy must wear chains when he and Charlotte do not. I explained that different rules apply to different people, and that the boy's restraints are like a parent's loving guidance, uncomfortable perhaps, but necessary for proper development. Marcus stopped reading, fists clenched. The psychological manipulation was staggering, teaching the enslaved child that his shackles were care, and teaching the white children that some people deserved chains simply because of their race. But Eleanor never once wrote the enslaved child's name. In dozens of diary entries spanning years, He was always the boy or their little companion. This erasure was deliberate. Enslaved people weren't individuals with names and identities. They were property, described by function, rather than personhood. Marcus needed to find the child's name. He requested the Hartwell plantation records from the South Carolina Department of Archives and History. Plantation ledgers often listed enslaved people by name, age, and assigned work. If the child had belonged to the Hartwell estate, there would be a record. The ledgers arrived as digital scans, heavy, leather-bound books filled with meticulous handwriting, documenting the buying, selling, births, deaths, and labor assignments of human beings treated as livestock. Marcus forced himself to read through the dehumanizing language, searching for any child who might match the boy in the photograph. In the 1854 ledger, under house servants, children, he found an entry that made him inhale sharply. Samuel Male, approximately 9 years, assigned to children's companion and lighthouse duties. Mother, Rose, deceased 1852. Father, unknown. Note: flight risk secured as of December 1853. Samuel. The boy finally had a name. Marcus traced Samuel's presence in the Hartwell records backward and forward from 1854. The documentation was sparse but devastating. Samuel had been born on the Hartwell plantation around 1845. His mother, Rose, had worked as a house servant until her death in 1852. The cause listed simply as fever, a term that covered everything from cholera to exhaustion to violence. After Rose's death, 7-year-old Samuel had been assigned to work in the main house. The 1853 ledger noted, Samuel shows intelligence and obedience. Assigned to attend Master William and Miss Charlotte, to assist with their needs and provide companionship. Well suited for this duty. The language was chilling in its matter-of-fact tone. Samuel hadn't been invited to be the children's friend. He'd been assigned to them. His companionship was labor. His existence was structured around serving white children barely older than himself. The December 1853 entry about Samuel's attempted escape appeared in the plantation ledger as well. Samuel apprehended 2 miles from property attempting flight. 1. 5 lashes administered. Fitted with wrist restraints to prevent future attempts. Restraints to remain until trustworthiness demonstrated. 1. 15 lashes. Samuel had been 8 years old. Marcus found more references to Samuel through 1854 and 1855. The restraints remained on his wrists for at least 18 months, long enough to leave the permanent scarring visible in the photograph. During this time, he continued to serve as William and Charlotte's companion, playing with them, attending their lessons, accompanying them on walks around the plantation grounds. The photograph from the summer of 1854 had been taken about 6 months after Samuel's escape attempt. Marcus studied the image again with this knowledge. Samuel's smile now appeared even more clearly, forced performance as survival. A child who had learned that appearing cheerful was necessary to avoid punishment, that showing fear or pain could provoke more violence. The white children's casual affection, Charlotte's hand on Samuel's shoulder, William's comfortable nearness, took on a different meaning as well. They likely did feel real fondness for Samuel. Children that age do form genuine attachments. But their affection existed entirely within a system where they owned him, where their father could have him whipped, shackled, or sold at any moment, where Samuel's needs and personhood were irrelevant beside their comfort and entertainment. In 1856, the ledger entries about Samuel shifted in tone. Samuel, age 11, becoming unsuitable for house service, shows increasing sullenness and resistance to instruction. Recommend reassignment to field work. Marcus knew what that meant. As Samuel grew older, as trauma compounded, maintaining the performance of cheerful companionship became impossible. The Hartwells interpreted his natural human responses as sullenness. The final entry about Samuel appeared in October 1856. Samuel sold to Mr. Thomas Crawford, plantation owner from Mississippi, for $650. Proceeds recorded. Samuel had been 11 years old. He was sold away from the only home he'd ever known, from the grave of his mother, and from any remaining family sent to Mississippi alone. The ledger recorded the transaction with the same clinical detachment used for livestock or furniture. Marcus searched Mississippi plantation records, trying to trace Samuel further, but the trail went cold. Enslaved people sold out of state were notoriously difficult to track, often deliberately so, as separation was a tool of punishment and control. Samuel disappeared into the historical void that swallowed millions of enslaved people whose names and stories were erased or reduced to property transactions. While Samuel's trail vanished, Marcus could easily trace what happened to William and Charlotte Hartwell. Their lives were fully documented in newspapers, society announcements, wills, and family histories preserved proudly by descendants. William Hartwell attended the College of Charleston, later managing his father's plantations until the Civil War. He served as a Confederate officer and returned home to rebuild the family's fortunes using exploitative labor contracts that mimicked slavery. He married, had 5 children, and died in 1903, remembered in his obituary as a pillar of Charleston society and a guardian of Southern heritage. Charlotte married into another wealthy plantation family at 18. She was known for her charity work. Much of it focused on uplifting the Black community through organizations that taught compliance and subservience. She died in 1911, praised as a woman of refinement and Christian virtue. Neither William nor Charlotte, in any letters or diaries preserved in the archives, ever mentioned Samuel, the boy who had appeared in photographs with them, who had played with them daily, who had worn shackles while serving as their childhood companion. He had been erased from their memory, or at least from the record they left behind. Marcus found one exception: a letter William wrote to his father in 1857, a year after Samuel had been sold. 13-year-old William wrote, "I sometimes think of the boy who used to attend me when I was younger. I wonder if he fared well in his new situation. Mother wrote that you'd sold him to a Mississippi planter. I hope he is treated kindly there." The casual tone was staggering. Samuel's violent separation, an event that likely destroyed whatever remained of Samuel's childhood, was reduced to a child's idle wondering, as if Samuel had simply changed jobs. Marcus discovered that the Hartwell family home still stood in Charleston, now converted into expensive condominiums. The plantation land had been sold off over the decades, but the main house and 10 acres remained, carefully preserved as an example of antebellum architecture. The Hartwell family also maintained an active historical society, promoting the legacy of their ancestors. Their website featured dozens of photographs, including formal portraits of James and Eleanor Hartwell, and later images of William and Charlotte as adults. But the 1,854 photograph of the 3 children was absent. Someone had chosen not to include it. Perhaps because Samuel's presence and the visible shackle marks made the image too uncomfortable. A reminder of truths the family preferred to forget. Marcus refused to let Samuel be erased again. 6 months after finding the photograph, he stood in the Equal Justice Initiative's Legacy Museum in Montgomery, Alabama, preparing for the opening of a new permanent exhibition, Childhood Under Slavery: The Hidden Truth in Family Photographs. The 1,854 image of William, Charlotte, and Samuel was the centerpiece. Conservators helped create a large-scale reproduction, revealing every detail, including digital enhancement that made the shackle marks unmistakable. Beside the photograph, a text panel read, "This photograph was staged to present an image of innocent childhood friendship. The 3 children are dressed in expensive clothing and pose together as apparent equals. But look closely at the wrists of the Black child. The marks you see are scarring from shackles, metal restraints this 8-year-old boy was forced to wear after attempting to escape slavery. This child, whose name was Samuel, was not playing with the white children by choice. He was assigned to them as property, forced to perform companionship while enduring violence and captivity. The exhibition included Eleanor Hartwell's diary entries displayed alongside documentation of Samuel's attempted escape, his punishment, and his eventual sale to Mississippi. Interactive displays allowed visitors to explore the broader context, the Hartwell family's wealth built on enslaved labor, the legal system that allowed children to be shackled and sold, and the deliberate erasure of enslaved people's names and identities from historical records. Marcus had also created a section tracing what happened to the three children as they grew older. Visitors could see photographs of William and Charlotte as adults, read their obituaries, and learn about the prosperous, respected lives they led. Then, they arrived at a simple panel with Samuel's name and dates. Samuel, born approximately 1845, sold away from South Carolina in 1856, further fate unknown. The contrast was deliberate and devastating: two children whose lives were meticulously documented and celebrated, and one child who vanished into historical silence. The exhibition's opening drew significant media attention. Major newspapers ran features, and NPR conducted an interview. But the most significant response arrived from an unexpected direction. 3 days after the exhibition opened, Marcus received an email from a woman named Grace Morrison in Jackson, Mississippi. The subject line read, "I think I'm descended from the boy in your photograph." Marcus's hands shook as he opened the message. Grace wrote, "My great-great-great-grandfather was a man named Samuel Rose. Family oral history says he was born enslaved in South Carolina around 1845 and was sold to Mississippi as a child. After emancipation, he took his mother's name, Rose, as his surname. He lived until 1923 and told his children and grandchildren about his time in Charleston, about being forced to serve as a companion to white children while wearing chains. He specifically mentioned being photographed with those children. My family has preserved his story for generations. When I saw the news coverage of your exhibition, I recognized his story immediately." Marcus and Grace spoke for 2 hours that evening. She was 63, a retired schoolteacher, and the keeper of her family's oral history stories passed down through 5 generations from Samuel himself. "He was traumatized by those years in Charleston," she explained. "He told my great-great-grandmother that the worst part wasn't the physical violence, though that was terrible. The worst part was being forced to pretend he loved his captors. Being forced to smile and play with children who owned him, who could have him beaten or sold at any moment. He said it made him feel like he was betraying himself, erasing his own humanity to make white people comfortable." Samuel had been sold to a cotton plantation in Mississippi in 1856, precisely as the Hartwell records indicated. The plantation owner, Thomas Crawford, worked him in the fields until the Civil War. After emancipation, Samuel stayed in Mississippi, working first as a sharecropper and later for the railroads. He married, had 6 children, and lived to age 78. "He was bitter," Grace said quietly. "My great-great-grandmother said he rarely smiled in adulthood. The performance of happiness he'd been forced to maintain as a child had damaged his ability to express genuine joy. He said white people stole his childhood twice, once by enslaving him, and again by forcing him to pretend enslavement was acceptable." Grace sent Marcus several photographs of Samuel from his later years. The images showed an elderly black man with a stern, weathered face, deep lines etched around his mouth, eyes heavy, with decades of pain. In every photograph, his hands were positioned to reveal the scars on his wrists, marks that remained more than 60 years after the shackles had been removed. "He insisted on that," Grace said. "He wanted proof to survive, proof that couldn't be erased or denied." Marcus felt tears on his cheeks. Samuel had understood something profound, that photographs could be used to distort truth, as the 1854 image had attempted by portraying slavery as gentle and domestic, but that photographs could also reveal truth if the subject refused to hide it. His adult portraits, with their deliberate display of scars, directly confronted the lie of that childhood photograph. Grace had more to share. Samuel remembered the white children. He said Charlotte used to cry when he was punished, begging her parents not to hurt him, though she never questioned the institution itself or tried to help him escape. He said that kind of selective sympathy was worse than cruelty, Grace explained. It made white people feel moral while doing nothing to change the conditions causing his suffering. Samuel had tried to find his family after emancipation, but discovered that most had been sold away before the war. He spent decades searching for siblings, cousins, aunts, and uncles, placing ads in black newspapers, writing to churches and aid societies. He found a few distant relatives but never reconnected with his immediate family. Slavery scattered them so thoroughly the bonds couldn't be restored, Grace said, her voice breaking. The Hartwells destroyed my family. They didn't just enslave my ancestors. They dismantled them, piece by piece, and then preserved their own history while erasing the people they brutalized. Marcus knew her family's story needed to be included in the exhibition. The world had to know that the nameless child in the photograph had lived, had descendants, and that his story had survived despite every attempt to silence it. Word of Grace's connection to Samuel reached Charleston, and the Hartwell family responded swiftly and defensively. Catherine Hartwell Bennett, William's great-granddaughter, sent Marcus a lengthy email, insisting that the exhibition presented an unbalanced, anachronistic view of the past. She claimed the Hartwells had provided care to the enslaved people they owned, and that the photograph demonstrated their kindness. She even suggested the marks on Samuel's wrists might be misinterpreted or photographic artifacts. Marcus replied with high-resolution images of Samuel's scars, Eleanor Hartwell's own diary entries describing the restraints, and plantation records documenting his punishment and sale. He also included Grace's contact information. Catherine never responded. Instead, she posted a public statement lamenting that activists were using historical photographs to shame families rather than promote reconciliation. The backlash was immediate. Historians refuted her claims, and activists noted that reconciliation, without acknowledgement of harm, was merely avoidance. The controversy drew even more visitors to the exhibition, and the photograph became widely recognized not as a charming relic of childhood, but as evidence of slavery's psychological violence. Marcus arranged for Grace to travel to Montgomery so she could see the exhibit in person. When she entered the gallery and saw the enlarged 1,854 photograph of her ancestor, she began to weep. Marcus stood beside her in silence. "He's so young," she whispered. "I've always known the story. But seeing his face, seeing how small he was, seeing the marks on his wrists, it's different. He was a baby. And they tortured him. They bought and sold him like furniture. They erased his name, his mother, his entire humanity." She reached out and touched the image of his face, her hand trembling. "But he survived," she said softly. "He lived. He had children, and grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. And we're still here. We remember him. They tried to erase him, but he's more permanent than all their monuments and mansions. His truth outlasted their lies." In the months that followed, Marcus expanded his research, searching for other photographs documenting enslaved children posed in similar situations. What he found formed a disturbing pattern: dozens of images from the 1,840 through the 1,860, showing white children posed alongside enslaved children, often dressed similarly and arranged to mimic friendship or equality. These photographs served a clear propaganda purpose. They were crafted to counter abolitionist claims that slavery was cruel and dehumanizing, presenting enslaved children as well cared for, cheerful, and integrated into enslavers' households. But when Marcus viewed high-resolution scans of these images, details emerged that contradicted their intended message. Enslaved children's bodies revealed signs of malnutrition, injury, and emotional strain. Their expressions and postures showed tension and resignation. And in some cases, Samuel's foremost among them, the physical evidence of violence was unmistakable. Marcus partnered with other researchers to create a comprehensive database of these photographs, documenting their origins, the enslavers' identities, and, when possible, the identities of the enslaved children. Genealogists and descendant communities joined the effort, helping to restore names and histories long buried or intentionally erased. Grace became deeply involved, connecting researchers with families who had preserved oral histories of enslaved ancestors. Through this expanding network, Marcus discovered 2 additional photographs of Samuel, both taken at the Hartwell plantation before his sale in 1856. In the first, Samuel appeared around age 7, standing behind Eleanor Hartwell in a formal family portrait. He wore shabby clothes and kept his hands awkwardly clasped in front of him, his expression blank. This was before his attempted escape, before the shackles. Even then, his body language carried the rigid obedience of a child who already understood the consequences of disobedience. The second photograph, taken in 1855, about a year after the garden bench image, showed Samuel alone. He stood against the wall of a plantation outbuilding, dressed again in carefully selected clothing. But the facade failed. His wrists were clearly bound in shackles, still in place a year after his escape attempt. His face did not pretend happiness. Instead, he stared directly into the camera, with a haunted, unguarded expression. Grace wept when Marcus showed her these images. "They documented everything they did to him," she said. "They photographed him in chains, and didn't even realize the truth staring back at them. They were so certain of their righteousness that they couldn't see what their own images revealed." Marcus included all 3 photographs in an expanded exhibition, arranged chronologically. Visitors saw Samuel transform from a weary but unbound 7-year-old to a shackled 8-year-old, forced to mimic joy, to an 11-year-old bearing the evident trauma of prolonged captivity. Alongside these were Samuel's adult portraits, the elderly man who intentionally positioned his wrist scars in every photograph, insisting on bearing witness. "These photographs tell 2 stories," Marcus wrote in the exhibition text. "The story enslavers wanted to tell that slavery was benign, that enslaved people were content, and the truth that photographs could not hide that slavery was violence, that it shaped and scarred every life it touched, that survivors carried its marks for the rest of their lives." 1 year after Marcus discovered the first photograph, the Equal Justice Initiative organized a memorial service for Samuel Rose in Charleston, held on a park that once sat on Hartwell plantation land. Over 200 people attended: historians, activists, descendants of enslaved people, and even a few descendants of enslavers willing to confront their family histories honestly. Grace spoke, reading a statement her family had prepared. Samuel Rose was born into slavery around 1845. He was forced to labor from the moment he could walk. He was shackled as a child for seeking freedom. He was sold at age 11 and never saw South Carolina again. He survived the Civil War, Emancipation, Reconstruction, and Jim Crow. He lived 78 years, despite a system built to destroy him, and he made sure his descendants would know his story, remember his name, and understand what he endured and overcame. For 140 years, the photograph of Samuel with William and Charlotte Hartwell was interpreted as a charming image of childhood innocence. Our family always knew the truth that Samuel was in chains when that photograph was taken, that his smile was coerced, that his childhood with the Hartwells was defined by violence and captivity. But no one listened to our oral history. It took a researcher, noticing the scars on Samuel's wrists, for the truth to be acknowledged. This is why we preserve these histories. This is why we look closely at images that seem innocent. This is why we believe the descendants of enslaved people when they tell us their stories, even when those stories challenge comfortable narratives. Samuel Rose existed. He mattered. He was a person, not property. He had a mother who loved him, a future beyond enslavement, and descendants who carry his memory forward. The Hartwells tried to erase him. They never used his name, sold him away, and celebrated their own history while denying his humanity. But he survived. We survived. And we are here today to say his name, to honor his life, and to ensure he is never forgotten again. Marcus then unveiled a memorial marker to be installed in the park. A simple, black granite stone, engraved with Samuel's name, dates, and a brief inscription. Enslaved as a child on this land, shackled, sold, but not broken, remembered by those who carry his story forward. Below the inscription was a reproduction of the 1854 photograph. Unlike the original, which attempted to disguise the reality of captivity, this version included arrows pointing to Samuel's wrists and text reading, "The marks you see are scars from shackles. This child was enslaved." His name was Samuel Rose. After the ceremony, Marcus and Grace stood quietly before the memorial. The landscape around them had changed dramatically since Samuel's childhood suburban homes replaced plantation buildings, but the history remained, now acknowledged in a way that could not be ignored. "Do you think he would be satisfied?" Marcus asked softly. "With the memorial, the exhibition, his story finally being told?" Grace thought for a moment. Samuel spent his whole adult life fighting to be seen as fully human, to have his experiences believed. He lived surrounded by people who denied slavery was cruel, who insisted enslaved people were content, who erased and justified the violence done to him. This memorial does what he spent his life trying to do. It insists on the truth. It names him. It acknowledges what was done to him. So, yes, I think he would find some peace in this. She looked at the photograph etched into the granite, the 8-year-old child with shackle scars on his wrists, forced to smile for the camera. "But I also think he'd want people to understand that remembering isn't enough," she continued. "These histories aren't just past. They created systems that still shape the present." Samuel's story matters not just because he suffered, but because understanding how slavery operated, how it was disguised, rationalized, and passed down, is essential to confronting its legacy today. Marcus nodded. He thought of the thousands of photographs, still needing close examination. The millions of enslaved people, whose names had been erased. The descendant communities, still fighting to be heard. But today, Samuel Rose was remembered. His face looked out from the memorial, no longer forced to smile, no longer erased, no longer silent. The photograph that had once been created to hide the truth of slavery had, through careful attention and the persistence of his descendants, become powerful testimony. Samuel had reached across 170 years through an image made of silver and glass. His scars, visible to anyone willing to look, had finally spoken, and their truth had changed everything.